Welcome to Break Free and Trust, a redesign for living. Join me, Chris.
And me, Jacqueline, for real conversations about life, death, and everything in between.
Learn to connect with your intrinsic power to grow and heal, how to laugh at your own humanness and not take life too seriously.
Through healthy conversations between the feminine and masculine, you learn how to harness the power of relationship and the mirror to befriend your shadow and to trust that any obstacle that gets in your way is there to help you grow.
Together, working at a practical level, you learn to trust that everything that is happening is for you, your growth, and ultimate freedom.
Our circumstances don't matter. It's only how we relate to them that does.
Get ready to befriend the wisdom of your body and the power of your mind.
Break Free and Trust starts now.
Welcome to Break Free and Trust, a redesign for living. I am Chris.
And I'm Jacqueline.
And in this episode, Jacqueline and I are going to tackle a question that arose from the last episode. And the question is, if people are generally operating from their unconscious conditioning or their early childhood programming, are they really responsible and accountable for their actions? So the concepts of accountability, responsibility, culpability will all be explored in the context of our conditioned behavior. We're going to take a path that will evolve us to a deeper sense of empathy and compassion for people's behavior. But we're also going to discuss how radical responsibility and prioritizing the self can be the off-ramp from our conditioning and into a redesign for more conscious living. And as always, we're a live show. We take questions in the second half of the show, put them in the chat or call in at 1-800-930-2819.
Thanks, Chris. So we spent a fair amount of time in our last episode talking about programming and conditioning. For those listeners that are just tuning in for the first time, can you help to break those down a little bit more? Yeah.
I'll start, but I think it's going to evolve into a conversation because it's a big topic. And if I think about it, there's some, like, we are at the limit. We are extremely conditioned beings. And it's, there's conditioning at a family level, a societal level, and just even conditioning to how we operate in life. And I'll just use some examples. At our very basic nature, when we're born, we're just basically these units of divine wonder, which have no knowledge about how to operate in the world, what to do or what not. And we immediately begin to be conditioned by our surroundings. We're given names for things. That's a tree. That's a chair. That's a bench. We jump up on the coffee table. Don't jump up on the coffee table. That's a rule. So much of this conditioning actually happens. It's part of our upbringing for us to actually, to navigate our surroundings and to survive and for our safety and for all these other things. And then there's societal conditioning on top of that, where it's okay. At a certain age, you go to school, you learn certain things. And when you're done that, you get a job, you go to work, you make money, you buy a house, you do all these other things, and then you retire. And so there's this societal conditioning that's more complicated than that, but that's an overlay. And then finally, there's this programmer conditioning, which is operating at the real unconscious level, which is whatever sort of situation we had to survive to get to adulthood, based on, the family we're born into, the country we're born into, what kind of challenges exist, whether we're bullied at school, we have an alcoholic in the family, those types of things. We develop all these various survival mechanisms in order to survive that environment that form this part of our conditioning that's more at the unconscious level. But when we really sit back and think about it, at almost every stage of our life, particularly growing up, we are being conditioned by someone, by something, for something. And before we stop and really look at it, we don't realize how much of the choices we make are actually just quite mechanical in nature. What would you add to it?
I'm not sure that I'd add anything at this point, except I think that the programming that is most interesting to me in reference to this podcast is the third one that you referenced, which is really about our own unconscious programming. And we'll delve into that a little bit more later. So after our podcast last time, Chris and I found ourselves in the forest, which we tend to do quite often, and in a pretty big conversation that was inspired by the conversation that we had with all of you. And the conversation was about responsibility, accountability, and culpability as it relates to our programming. And I think it'd be a really great way for us to start off if you'd be willing to share a little bit about those three ideas before we get started.
Right. And I cheated. I looked them up. I looked up the definitions of them because actually I want to get precise as we talk about this. And so I'm going to read these out. Accountable, someone who is
You know, by the way, if you cheated, you wouldn't tell anybody.
right. Okay, I'm not
Okay,
really cheating. Being
go.
honest, right? Someone who's accountable is completely responsible for what they do and must be able to give a satisfactory reason for it. Responsible, be able to answer for one's conduct and be able to choose for oneself between right and wrong. And finally, culpable, deserving of blame or censure. In other words, guilty. So from that starting point, I'm going to ask you, Jacqueline, based on what I just said about an explanation of conditioning, if you think people are truly accountable or responsible for their actions that arise from that conditioning.
So I didn't cheat and look them up.
Right.
And I actually want to add a little bit more to those definitions, or maybe even give our listeners a different way of looking at them. Like, one of the things that I love about, I can't remember actually who said it the first time, but I've seen it many places since, that the word responsibility actually can be broken down into response able. And are we able to respond? Is a really different way of looking at responsibility for me.
I love that.
And then I was thinking also about the word accountable and account able. And what came up for me in that was, it's funny, the word recount comes up more than account, but are we able to actually account for our behavior if we don't even know what our programming is? So I'm going to take a step back and see if I can answer your question with those definitions in mind a little bit too.
When you talked about the accountable thing, I just want to add something to it because what jumped to my mind is when you're accounting, you've got a ledger with assets and liabilities. Are you able to properly account?
That's
right.
That's true. Yeah. And yeah, absolutely. So I think language is really important, and being able to look at words and break them down is also really important. In the presence process that we've talked about a couple of times, Michael Brown does that quite often. And one of them that he speaks about is blame. And he breaks it down into be lame, because when we blame, we actually don't have any power. So I think playing with words is actually a really powerful thing to do. It's a long way of getting to the answer to your question, which for me is more, it's a thought. I don't have an answer. Okay. The programming that we're talking about, most of it really happens on an unconscious level. Whether we're speaking about the programming that happens at school or within our families, or we're speaking about the unconscious programming that happens for us generally during the first 7 years of our lives. If something's unconscious, how could we possibly be responsible for it? We don't even know it's there. And how could we then be accountable or culpable for it? So when I say that, I think one of the first things I would ask myself is, so does that mean that we can do whatever we want whenever we want and it's not our faults? And my answer to that is no, absolutely not. And at the same time, if we're unaware of what's actually driving our car, we think it's us, but actually what often is driving our car is all of the shadows that we've sort of relegated to the closet, and we're not even looking at them. But in order to avoid them, our entire life is run by them. How could we possibly be responsible for our behavior? When I sit with a question, and I've thought about it quite a bit actually, what I would say is that until we have come into a place of awareness where we begin to see where some of these behaviors are actually affecting us, or these programs, sorry, we don't have responsibility, accountability, or culpability for them. But once our witness wakes up or our observer wakes up and our awareness comes up, wakes up along with it, that changes. So, can I give you an example?
Please.
Okay. I'm going to make one up on the spot. I did, but I'm going to make one up on the spot. And I'll make one up that's like pertinent to right now.
Mm-hmm.
So, you and I were having a conversation this morning. I was feeling particularly and strangely emotional. And I say strangely because it sort of came out of left field for me. And you said, do you want to sit with me and have a conversation about it? And my response was, no, because I know that in this moment, I'm not clear about what's actually happening with me. And if I do bring it up into conversation, I'm going to create drama for us. So can you give me a little bit of time and space to be able to tune into what's really happening? Right? So I just spent the morning with a dear friend. And in that conversation, which I shared with her what happened this morning, she said, it sounds like uncertainty is something that is hard for you to be with. Mm. And when she said it, I really, like, it hit me quite hard. And I was like, oh, that's what this is about. So in that, all of a sudden, I wake up to an awareness about what it was that was driving my car. What was driving my car was a reaction to uncertainty. And so now that I've recognized that, now I step into a place where I do have to be responsible and accountable for it, which means recognizing that one, uncertainty is a trigger for me. Mm-hmm. Two, it's my responsibility to deal with the discomfort that brings me. And if I want to come into conversation with you, then I need to take responsibility for it and be accountable for it. And then I would actually say, in the realm of culpability, from that awareness, if I decide to act out because of that, then I am culpable. But I think that like my analogy or my recount of actual events, which just happened, speaks to a really high level of awareness around myself. Yeah. Right. And I think it's taken me a long time to get here. And often I still need a mirror to show me what's happening. But I don't think that that's where we begin. We begin by slowly beginning to see how the world mirrors to us aspects of ourselves that we might be blind to. And then we get really curious and start to look at ourselves. And that process is really uncomfortable and takes time. And then we begin to see the patterns of behavior or thoughts that we walk with every day. And as that happens, we become more and more capable of responding to our environments rather than reacting to them. And then we can be more accountable for our behaviors. Does that answer your question?
It does. And yeah, thank you for sharing the story from this morning, because we have not connected in that sense. So I mean, when I hear you saying the question is that if you can't be responsible, it's because you're reactable. You haven't found the ability to be, people haven't found the ability to be responsible. So they're reactable still because they're coming out of their conditioning.
So if you can't be responsible, I'll say it differently.
Yeah, please.
We are reactive to our blind spots. Okay. So when something is sitting around and it's lurking around unconsciously, the discomfort that comes from tapping that causes us to react, because we have something to protect. We don't actually know our own programming. We don't know what's there. So we're going to react to defend it. You know, right now as we're speaking, I remember being Jonah, my oldest, being in a playground when he was about 7, maybe 6, and somebody mistakenly knocked him on the back. It was totally a mistake. They just didn't see him. And he went, "Hey, what's that for?" And I watched it and I was like, oh, he's constantly in fear of protecting something. He had no idea that there was nothing to react to, but he's busy protecting himself. As soon as we start to see that, then we have the ability to begin to respond differently. Is that?
Yeah. And what I guess where my question leads me now is that, like, from a societal basis, if we're coming to this place that, listen, we're all conditioned, we're all programmed, we've all got trauma, we've all been steered toward this, we all have an operating system. Does this lead us to a place in society where nobody's responsible or accountable for anything unless they've done this work? Because I worry, I don't think a lot, I don't think it's the majority of the population that has done this work or in this work. So I'm going to, like, hazard to guess 85% of the population is operating completely out of their conditioning. How does this conversation, how do we deal with that?
Well, you bring, I mean, as you're speaking to that, what I would say is, well, we're living in a society that is, the victim consciousness is so high that nobody's responsible for anything. Right.
Right.
Um, and I actually think that we're getting to a place where there's got to be a breaking point. And there needs to be a shift, which means that all of this outward facing energy that we're putting into listening to what we're supposed to be doing needs to shift to an inward facing energy where we need to start looking at ourselves. Because what's happening out there in the world is nothing more than a reflection of what's happening in our inner worlds. And reaction is constant. And even as you start to wake up to your witness and you start to see your own behaviors, it doesn't mean you stop reacting. It just means that your awareness of yourself grows and your awareness of your reactions grow. And then slowly you can begin to train your nervous system not to be in a place of reactivity.
Right.
But how do we get there?
Or how do we get there? How do we deal in the world around us? So I'm just thinking, I've gone off thinking about our justice system, that if you commit a crime, you're held responsible and accountable for that crime. But what we're inherently saying is that may not be true. And maybe we've evolved with that a little bit, but maybe it depends whether you come from a broken home, or you come from a bad neighborhood, or you come from a lower socioeconomic class. That's going to have a profound impact on your actions. How do we deal with that?
This is way above my pay grade, dude.
Right.
I mean, yeah. I think, well, I'll answer that. I'm going to answer that.
Yeah, we're not solving any problems here.
Yeah, but I think I'm going to answer that a little bit differently than maybe you intended it. We were sitting yesterday in the car having a conversation with my dad about politics. And part of the conversation that we were having was about oppressor versus victim and different kind of situations. And one of the things that he said, one of the things that my dad asked was, well, what would you have done differently? How would you operate differently than this government did? And I think your response was actually quite powerful, because your response was, well, a knee-jerk reaction leads to violence. What would happen if instead we actually took some time and got quiet? Governments took some time and got quiet and asked a question, which was, how could I operate differently? Maybe life would look a little bit different now if that's what happened. And I think that there's something that we're being called to in society that's actually asking us all to slow down enough to be able to ask that question and be able to respond, which means checking in with my nervous system and calming my nervous system down enough so that I can remain connected to my humanity. Because when I move into reactivity, I'm in survival mode. And survival mode leads me to attack, defend, freeze, fawn. It doesn't lead me to a place of creativity. And I actually think that these times are calling us to a different place, which is violence met with violence creates more violence. And we need to shift gears. But let's go to that question about, let's take that sort of idea and then bring that to your question about crime.
Yeah.
If we're to really stop and think about people that commit crimes, do you think that anybody wakes up in the morning and says, I'm going to be as shitty as I possibly can today? I don't. I think a lot of behaviors that happen because our unconscious programming is driving us. And the idea, let's say, of not having enough food to feed my family is going to lead me into acts that I might otherwise not want to engage in. I think we're all operating out of fear.
Or even, more broad than that, hurt people hurt people.
100%.
Right.
But we live in a society that likes to punish hurt people.
And I think when you're speaking, that's the light bulb went off for me. Like, you answered the question beautifully. It's that when it comes to the legal system, it's like it's so focused on the reactive nature to it, which is retribution.
Yeah.
There's something bad. The reactive nature is, okay, punish with retribution. And of course, that doesn't lead to actually getting at the root of the behavior. And if anything, it probably just reinforces the behavior. It's anger with anger, with revenge, versus if we're understanding this idea of conditioning and programming, then maybe the way through, just like you talked about in the geopolitical example, is forgiveness followed by redemption and salvation. And when you move into that energy from the reactive nature of revenge into the nature of forgiveness, you start to transform the situation and actually the person. The person can evolve spiritually, as well as maybe even be open to getting at the bottom of, hey, why am I doing these things? Versus just hardening them into that program.
So let's talk about forgiveness.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's very hard to forgive somebody else for something that they've done to us if we can't meet ourselves with that level of compassion. When we hold ourselves hostage to specific standards that are most often programmed from the time we're quite young, according to
what is the summary of
our
this?
family's rules, society's rules, schools' rules, etc.
So
when we can't meet those, we often turn on ourselves and we become incredibly judgmental or self-critical. And we walk around carrying a lot of shame that is unspoken, that we cover up with all kinds of things. And then somebody does something to us and we're asked to forgive. It's very hard to forgive another person if you haven't experienced what self-forgiveness or self-compassion actually looks like. And yet, without the capacity to do that, there is only good and bad in the world.
Mm-hmm.
There's right and wrong. There's not actually just people walking around doing their best to figure things out. So you've experienced a ton in your life. And you've been in many situations where forgiveness was not something that was easily granted to you for acts that you did. They were pretty shitty. But you found a way to forgive yourself and to free yourself from the shame that you carried around it. How did you do that?
Hmm.
Because nobody forgave you, not right away. And actually, because of that, you were forced into a place in yourself where either you walked around and carried a shroud of shame around you, or you found a way to forgive and invite life. And you chose the second.
Yeah.
Which is, I think, actually in some ways a lot harder of a path. How'd you do that?
It's interesting. It's a great question, because that is what happened. And my, what I'll call my salvation and my redemption, came from the ability to forgive myself and being forgiven by higher power. But it was, as you alluded to earlier in the conversation, I got to the place where stuff had gone so awry in my life, and that it was inexplicable to me. I was literally asked the question, how the hell did I get here? Like, it almost felt like, if I described the last year and a half of, what I'll call my bottom, it really felt like I was like possessed, in a sense. Like, I wasn't operating under my free will. I was just reacting to everything and everything I was doing was making things worse. And it took me to this place, where I felt I had no choice but to try to really understand what happened there. What is this operating system working under? What is this conditioning I'm working under that has caused me to do these things, or has been driving these actions? And as I spent the time understanding that, integrating it, I learned to see where it came from. And in that, began to recognize I wasn't necessarily accountable for it. I'm not necessarily responsible for it, and I'm not culpable for it in that sense, because I could see what happened. But I then chose to take responsibility for it. I chose to take accountability for it. I'm not going to accept culpability for it. And in that, was able to forgive myself. Now, I said a ton in there that probably needs to be explored.
It does. And I just want to say that, forgiveness, there's something really, it's in my listening to you, I would say there's something really heroic about the act of forgiveness. And I don't mean heroic in a big, glamorous way. I mean heroic on your knees with nowhere to go kind of way. There's something, true forgiveness is probably the most powerful thing that exists out there for us. And it's probably the hardest thing to do when our programming leads us to look elsewhere. And with that, how about we take a break and we'll come back and continue?
Sounds good.
Welcome back, everybody. So I find this conversation really interesting because, Chris and I have little chats about what we're going to talk about. And then we always end up in places that we never really thought we'd go. And forgiveness has shown up as a really powerful piece of this. And as we were talking, one of the things that came up for me was a mantra, or, well, I'll say it's a mantra that's used in a old Hawaiian healing technique called Ho'oponopono. And the mantra is, I'm sorry, please forgive me, I love you, thank you. And the idea there is that if I'm ever reacting to somebody or to something, then the reaction is mine. And my job is to clear my channel enough to be able to then be responsible in conversation. And the way that I clear my channel is actually to apologize to myself, forgive myself, remind myself that I love myself, and say thank you and set myself free. And what comes up here is really interesting, which is that ultimately, any reaction that we have to anybody outside of us or to any situation outside of us has is coming from a place of something within us that's unintegrated.
100%. Yeah.
And
Everyone.
Yeah, 100, all of us, without question. And whatever it is that's unintegrated in me is a place where, in reaction to fear, upset, a need for love, survival, I adopted certain patterns of being, which actually got in the way of me being authentic and true to myself. And in so doing, I have not actually tended to the part of myself that needed tending to in that moment, and have probably spent most of my life not tending to that part. And there comes in my programming. And actually, the first and biggest, well, it might not be the first actually, but the biggest job that I have to do in this lifetime is to get to a place where I can forgive myself for abandoning me, for not hearing me, for not making that voice significant. And I'm using those words intentionally because words like needing to be significant, needing to be seen, needing to be heard, needing to be valued are the things that we hear in relationship all the time. But actually, when they come up, they're really pointing to a place where we didn't do that for ourselves. And so the moment that I can forgive myself for the ways in which I didn't tend to me is the moment that all of a sudden my compassion for humanity also really awakens. And what I hear in your story that you were sharing before is that you got to a place where you really had two choices. You forgive yourself, or you were contemplating killing yourself. And you chose the first.
Yeah. And I didn't know that was the choice at the time. that's been illuminated in hindsight that was the choice I was making. But that the choice I was making at the time was simply to surrender. Simply to surrender and take responsibility for where I was and take accountability and responsibility for where I was. That was the start. And in a sense, what I would say is this taking responsibility and accountability is the ultimate path to forgiveness.
And the ultimate path to freedom.
Ultimately, further in radical responsibility is the ultimate path to freedom.
Because in taking accountability and responsibility for where you had gotten to, you also then put yourself in a position where you could tap into creative power rather than to be shrouded in shame.
Yeah.
And being able to tap into creative power gave you access to so much more than shame ever could.
Yeah. And as you take in this active response, taking responsibility, it forces you to look at, well, what was happening within me that was leading to these actions that I'm now clearly responsible for. And you begin to see, your own conditioning and the own way you're acting and how it's played out in the world and caused all this chaos. And the deeper you go into it, the more you explore it and begin to understand it, the more you can begin to see, I can begin to see your programming, your conditioning. And then when I see it in the world, I can say, well, I recognize that is not you. That is your programming. And I can take a separate the beautiful soul that you are and your programming. And I think you find, I have a recovery background, and most of you who've listened to the show before know this. And this is where this comes from. This idea of surrender comes from. And there's this gift of desperation because life gets so painful and causes so much damage that you're forced to surrender. Well, in that, and why I call it a gift of desperation, because at that place, it was painfully obvious to me that I was a big problem. And so at that stage, okay, I can't deny that I've caused all this harm. And now I'm finally willing to take some responsibility for it and look at it. But you're willing to take so much responsibility at that stage that you're willing to look at everything. And so start looking at what my fears are, what my limiting beliefs are, and then look at how those things all translated in my relationships. And it creates the willingness to go out and apologize to all these people, So in the past, what I would have done, I've seen the world would, oh, these people are all doing these things to me, and I'm sitting there in this victim and blame. But in this place of surrender and desperation, you're just like, I just got to say sorry for my part. I don't even care what those people did to me, or it doesn't matter, because I've gotten to this place where I can see what I've done, and I'm sorry for this, and I'm going to go apologize. And in this process, what I found I was doing is I was forgiving everybody. I didn't need to hold what they had done because I was too busy worrying about, focused on what I had done, that I'm in this process of radical forgiveness to everyone in my life. And by the time I get to the end of that process, I'm finally in a place to forgive myself. But I had to forgive everybody else first before I could finally forgive me. And that's how I see this sort of whole technology playing itself out in a way. Surrender to responsibility and accountability, to forgiveness of others, to finally forgiving of myself.
I think there's different ways to get there.
Yeah, that was just my path, of course.
Yeah,
that's just that's 100% my own experience.
yeah. I think there's many different paths to get there, and I would say that mine over time has actually looked really different.
Mm-hmm.
And it's looked much more like in being able to witness, and I would say acknowledge my own behaviors, my own pain, and get really real and strip myself of all of the layers of armor that I didn't even know were there. My capacity to be tender with myself is increasing exponentially, my capacity to be tender with others, and recognizing that we're all walking around with lots of armor and lots of masks in order to protect something so vulnerable that we don't even really understand. And that when we can forgive ourselves for having to mask up and armor up, we can also then recognize that everyone else around us is walking around in the same way. So different paths to the same place.
But I mean, the thing commonality is you can't, once you see it, it's impossible to unsee it. Use my example, I can see that my absolute incessant need to overachieve and to, get caught up in material things and things like that will result.
Play with me a little bit.
Yeah.
You talk a lot about this part of you that was a program of overachievement. Overachievement is something in our society that our society values in a lot of ways. Can you talk about one of the masks that maybe was a little uglier so that people can be invited into owning deeper ones? So I'll give an example.
Yeah.
Like control, or your need for control.
Oh, for sure. Yeah.
Okay. So places like that, maybe the ones that are a little bit darker.
Yeah, absolutely. And so this is when I sat down and did the work, and it was interesting. I worked with the coaches. I did this, and I went over sort of all these ways I acted in positive ways, assets, these ways I operated negatively, that we called them defects. And I went through it, and on a superficial basis, I'd convinced myself that most of my defects were somehow positive too, and as were my assets. And this coach who'd done this with 1,000 people before found this common element in everything. My people pleasing, my sacrificing myself for people, my doing things for people, were all me trying to control people in a roundabout way. I would take people's agency away by going out of my way to provide for them, or to people please, or to try to get them to do something nicer than expecting that thing in return. But my whole conditioning and patterning had been one of, I need to control my environment in order to be safe. And I became a master of controlling my environment, all sorts of places, without even knowing that's what I was doing. I would have considered myself easy breezy, go with the flow kind of guy at the time, but it wasn't true at all. I was a control freak. And it was ultimately, if I trace it all the way back, and this goes to our conditioning, it's from growing up in an alcoholic household that was so chaotic, and it felt probably so unsafe to me as like a 7-year-old boy that I feel I didn't have control everything to be safe. And it was probably true. It was probably really true at the time, but I never let go of that. And it started to take control, no pun intended, of my life. And everything falls apart for me, of course, because my ability to control the external environment is very limited. And if I try to, it's ultimately lead to some type of a failure and a breakdown, which it did.
So it's
Is that what you're
interesting.
getting at?
Yeah.
Okay.
Because I think that, when you use overachievement, it looks too pretty according to the way society's programmed. And I think it's important to recognize that, you know, in some strange way, and I hate the word, but I think it's really true, is that we have all become master manipulators. We've become master manipulators of our environments in order to protect that which we are most afraid to see ourselves or to feel ourselves, and for other people to see. But the thing that we're most afraid of isn't other people. We think it is, but we're afraid to look at it ourselves. And that's where the forgiveness or the acknowledgement and compassion needs to come in.
Yeah. And there's like, and control in a sense is like this underlying theme in it. Like, I'm going to relate it. I chose achievement to try to control my environment. If if I'm successful, if I have wealth, I have all those things, I have a good capacity to control my environment from that achievement. Other people use association with groups and clubs and things like that to control their environment. Hey, if I'm part of this group and I go along with what they're saying and I signal all the same things as this group, I'm also going to feel safe because I'm controlling my environment. And then there's the last one. It's this almost like it's this powerlessness to control. If I've set myself as victim, I'm also going to control my environment in a roundabout way by pulling in rescuers and being a victim. But there are all these facets of trying to control your environment.
Hmm. But you also mentioned other ones that I think are in some ways more relatable, which are we become people pleasers, we
Yep.
become harmony keepers, we become self-sacrificing, we do all kinds of things in order to weave a web that has us being perceived in a certain way, rather than actually seeing what's going into what's actually weaving the web for real. And I ask the question because we all do it. It's not just Chris or me. It's no, it's all of us. And our brand looks a little bit different, and it comes maybe from a little bit different of a place, but ultimately we are little children running around in adult bodies trying to protect that which you couldn't deal with when we were really small. And once you start to see that in yourself and then in other people, the capacity to be forgiving rises exponentially. And the capacity to see people beyond just their behaviors rises exponentially. And we can begin to hold people much more tenderly than by having to create villains and victims. And I think it's interesting. So much of what we do, as we've said in previous podcasts, is that we're looking to the outside for confirmation of who we are. But actually, what's really needed is for us to look to the inside and connect with and align with what's really true within us, which is much harder to do than it is to be in a blame victim mentality. But it requires a level of self-reflexivity and of selfishness, which is an interesting word that I would love you to begin to introduce to our audience, because it's something that I know that you've been working with a lot in your work right now.
Yeah. In fact, thanks. And I just wrote a blog piece called Be Selfish, and I can emphasize selfish with a capital S. And this is the our authentic self, our true self. And so much of what we do in life is to, as Jacqueline just outlined, we're operating under conditioning under 1,000 different forms of fears, and doing these various things to protect ourselves, to the mask we wear out in public to be seen a certain way, so that we fit in, so that we're accepted, so that we'll be loved, so we'll get all these things. And in a sense, all those actions are a self-betrayal. They're not a selfish action.
And self-betrayal is the most common and most painful of betrayals, which leads us to look outside for people to tend to and care for us, to see us, to hear us, to love us, to value us, when actually the cry for help is really coming from inside. And the only person that can meet that is you, in alignment with unity consciousness, the divine, whatever you want to speak to.
Yeah, and these acts we're talking about. So the word selfish, and it's a play on words, and that's why I use it. It creates a conversation. It's traditionally seen in one sense of the world as this sort of character trait that's considered unwanted or even vile. Well, what a selfish person. This isn't the selfish that we're referring to here. And I would even go so far as to say that definition of selfish is the wrong word, because those types of acts that are they're meant in a way, they're coming from, if I'm acting in that particular selfish way, it's more self-indulgence. It's more operating on my conditioning. It's more, these are the things I'm reacting to. These are the things you're doing automatically in order to protect myself, to show up a certain way in the world, to present myself in this way, to be the avatar, the character I'm trying to play. It's not anything that's serving my higher self. It's just serving my conditioning. It's self-indulgence.
So that sounds really ego-based.
Very much ego-based.
So what's the kind of selfish that you're talking about?
Forgiveness is the most radical of selfish acts. Being kind to everyone is the most radical of selfish acts. Being compassionate to everyone is a selfish act. And so at the surface, it doesn't really make sense. But why I'm saying that is, think of what happens to you when something happens to you and you seek revenge and you go after that person. You have this sort of feeling in your body. It's almost like this anxiety, and you're revved up, and it sort of feels good in a strange sort of energy way.
You have adrenaline running through your body.
Adrenaline, dopamine. Yeah. And as a recovered drug addict, it feels like certain drugs. So I think that anger, that, yeah, I got them all charged up. Right. And we can get really on that pattern of that. That's our conditioning. That's our indulgence. When I say something like a selfish act is that of kindness, is think of the times you've gone out of your way to be super kind to someone who maybe didn't deserve it, maybe didn't know. How good did you actually feel inside? That's the self doing an act that actually is serving something much beyond our conditioning, when we're extremely compassionate to people who maybe, in our gold mind, don't deserve it. What's that feeling we get inside? That's the selfish act. So these are the acts that we do that are outside of our conditioning, but they make us feel good. They take us out of this place of anger and fear and desire and into this place of peace, happiness, and joy. These are the sort of the selfish acts that I'm talking about, that if we really want to transform our life, we need to start working and doing more of these. And it starts with one selfish act to get the whole thing going. But from that one, keep building on that.
So I'm a little confused listening to you.
Yeah, tell me.
How is that selfish? How is it? Why are you using the word selfish to describe acts of generosity and kindness and forgiveness?
Because when I'm using the word self, I'm referring to our higher self, our authentic self, not our ego-based false self, smaller self. So these are the acts that serve who we truly are. And what we truly are is not this separate individual that's separated from everybody else and from all of creation, but we're individuated piece of consciousness is connected to everyone and everything. So when we are kind to someone else, we're in fact being kind to ourselves. When we're compassionate to someone else, we're in fact being compassionate to ourselves, because all of us are connected. There's no separation. And the more we perform these selfish acts, the more we ease this pain of believing we're separate in the world and into this wholeness and this divinity, which is what we actually are. These are all the acts that serve the self, not the egoic mask or shell that exists around it.
I love that. It also would seem to me that we are taking care of the little self through those acts. Because, and when I say the little self, I don't mean the small s self. I mean the really young version of ourselves that we actually made bad because he or she or they didn't fit a mold. And your selfish acts, as you're defining them, are actually acts that would honor I hate to use the word. I don't know why inner child drives me so crazy, but it is our inner children.
It's a word people understand.
Yeah. Your word selfish act actually means that you'd be honoring your inner child in that moment.
Yeah. Well, let me ask you a question here. Why wouldn't you be kind to everybody, regardless of their beliefs, regardless of what they've done in their past, regardless of what you've heard about them? Why wouldn't you be kind to everybody?
Because you're not practiced at being kind to yourself.
Yeah, that's right. And what do you think you lose by being? It's almost this idea of like we started at the start of the show. Something does something to us, and we want to react with revenge or anger. What do we think we get out of that? And more importantly, what do we think we lose if we don't do that?
I think we lose our righteousness when we don't do that. And what we gain by attacking or being angry or filled with rage or trying to punish, it is ultimately a nervous system that gets punished itself in the process because anger makes us sick. And holding on to upset, wanting to punish people, wanting to hold people accountable for behaviors that we think that they should have done differently. Actually, at the end of the day, it only hurts us.
Yeah.
And it lowers our vibration, which then contributes to a vibration in the world that is far lower than any one of us wants to live it.
Yeah, and it's interesting. And I know we're running out of time here, and you've had such an interesting question about getting into the selfish act. I think it needs its own episode here, because I think I've covered it at the surface and not very well. So I want to come back to this thing. But that one thing that I asked that I saw your response to it is like, why would we not be kind to absolutely everybody, regardless of their beliefs and whatnot? And I struck myself when I asked this question. I want to explore this a bit more because it doesn't make any sense why we're not.
Well, I think it's time for us to come back to that next time, and we can continue to explore how our programming gets in the way of that.
All right. Thank you.
Thanks for being with us today, you guys.
You've been listening to me, Chris.
And me, Jacqueline, on Break Free and Trust, a redesign for living.
Tune in every second and fourth Monday at 3 p.m. on Transformation Talk Radio for more real conversations about life, death, and everything in between.
Learn to connect with your intrinsic power to grow and heal, how to laugh at your own humanness and not take life too seriously.
Through healthy conversations between the feminine and the masculine, you will learn how to harness the power of relationship and the mirror to befriend your shadow, and to trust that any obstacle that gets in your way is there to help you grow.
For more information or to connect with us personally, visit theway-healing.com. That's theway-healing.com.